I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross. All right, so we are in Revelation chapter 17 this morning. Remember that we have been talking about the seven vials of wrath, or the seven bowls of wrath. And we went through that vision. And we got through the seven vials of wrath. And so right now we are coming to the end. And so we're coming to the last real end of everything. And at the last time, remember we were talking about the Battle of Armageddon and the forces that were set up against God, and they were coming against God, and God is going to judge those who were persecuting Christians and those who were against him. And so that's really what the remainder of the next few chapters are going to do. And then the last few chapters, the last 2.5 chapters, are really talking about victory for the church and ultimate victory for the saints. And so let's get the beginning of Revelation 17. We'll read the first 2 verses and we'll get Gord to get those.
And one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of those sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk."
All right, so we have here the discussion of the judgment against what we're going to find is Babylon the Great, who is sometimes referred to as the Great Whore, or in this version, the Great Prostitute. The English Standard Version, I guess, doesn't like using the word whore because that has a little harsher sounding name. A prostitute is saying the same thing, but that's what we're going to be talking about. She is going to be referred to as this great prostitute, or later on, Babylon the Great. And so question 1 is, who showed John the judgment of the great whore? According to verses 1 and 2.
One of the 7 angels had the 7 bowls.
Yes, and so this really connects this chapter really with the last one. When we talk about one of the 7 angels who had one of the 7 bowls of wrath, "Come, I'm going to show you the judgment." And so this is really, that's what the 7 bowls of wrath were really showing, was the judgment. And so this is more like a clearer picture of what this judgment is going to be. So one of those 7 angels invites John to see the judgment of the great whore, the final judgment of this great whore prostitute. And so question 2 asks, upon what 3 things did we read? Yeah, we did read that. Upon what 3 things did on what 3 things did the woman sit? Did we get that?
I don't think they're all contained in the first 2 verses.
No, they're not all contained in the first 2 verses. Let's get the I'll go up and get verses 3 to 6. So we get Bill and then over to Annie.
So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 7 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication.
I'm sorry, I missed Annette. She's hiding behind Gord, so Annette can get the next.
And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitution, of whore, and of God, of earth's abomination. And I saw a woman drunk with blood of saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And I saw her and marveled greatly.
All right, so we'll go back to question 2.
well, we'll talk about the first thing first. There is three things that we'll deal with. But what is the first thing, according to verses 1 and 2, that she is seated on?
Scarlet something.
Not in verse 2.
Verse 3.
So many waters.
She sits on many waters. So that's the first thing. The other two, Gord's right, that he's answering a little bit later on in the question because I sort of combined these two. She sits on many waters. What does that represent? Many waters. What do you believe that represents?
She's all places. Many places.
Yeah. Many peoples, multitudes, nations, tongues, as far as that she sat, remember this is Babylon, right? We'll discuss who Babylon is in a few moments, but you probably have an idea who this is. Whoever this is, at this point of the chapter, she is over many people. She is sitting on many waters. Now, ancient Babylon literally dwelt on many waters, and that's why this imagery is used here. In Jeremiah chapter 51, we'll come across to Annie, verse 13 of Jeremiah 51.
O you who dwell by many waters, each new treasures, your end has come, the sweat of your life has come.
Read the entire chapter of Jeremiah 51 on your own time, and you're going to find we are talking about Babylon in this chapter. And this, in Jeremiah's time, is literal Babylon. Remember, Jeremiah lived during the time of the start of the Babylonian captivity. And so Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar were at the forefront of prophecy at that time. They were the great kingdom. They were Babylon the Great. And they sat, the city of Babylon sat on many waters. If you take a look at a map of Iraq today, you would find the Tigris and Euphrates branch out right where Babylon sat. And so when Jeremiah uses this language to talk about physical Babylon, now when we come to Revelation, where we're not talking about a physical Babylon, we're talking about a symbolic Babylon, that she sat on many waters is the reason why this was used. This imagery is used. If you're going to talk about Babylon, you will talk about this many waters. And in this case, her empire is over many peoples. And so that's really the imagery we're talking about here, this Babylon sitting upon many waters. It says here in verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality or fornication. The people of the earth have become drunk on the wine of her fornication. And so, politically, economically, and religiously, the world has been swept up in the evils of Rome. And remember, that's our context really here. That Roman world empire. And so, that's what we're talking about in the first two verses. And so then we come to verse 3, and we saw this woman. What was the woman seated on? This is Gord's answer. Scarlet what?
Scarlet beast.
Scarlet beast. She was sitting on the scarlet beast. Now, what's the beast? What is the beast represented in this book?
Is that political power of Rome?
Political power of Rome. Jeff?
It does sound similar to the dragon in chapter 12, verse 3.
Yeah, it's going to be similar to the dragon, but the dragon, I believe, is a little bit separate because we will have...
What about the red beast?
Yes. Oh, yes.
7 heads.
Yeah. No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm certainly not disagreeing with you. But like I said, when we talked about the beast, even the beast had, remember, was it the 10 heads or the 7 heads or whatever? And so Well, the beast usually was representative of the empire, with the dragon being representative of the devil. But all in all, they're working together. Like I said, they're working in concert. It's not that the Roman Empire was working against the devil. No, the Roman Empire was working with the devil. And so the woman was seated on a scarlet-covered beast. And what, Jeff sort of answered part of that question, but what described this woman in the scarlet beast? How is she clothed? Purple and scarlet. Gold, jewels, and pearls. Very good. What about verse 3? I said verse 4, but verse 3.
She's full of names.
Names of?
Full of names of blasphemy.
Sure. And then we have 7 heads and 10 horns, which Jeff alluded to. And so we have all of this. So, full of names of blasphemy. What would that be?
What are the names?
No, not what the specific names are, but what would that sort of be describing? If we were to take an overall general picture, full of names of blasphemy.
Blasphemy is something that dishonors what is good, right? Which dishonors God.
Yes. In other words, anything that's against God. Whether it's false idol worship, whether it's rejection of Jesus Christ, all rejection of the Holy Spirit, full of names of blasphemies. In other words, this is not a godly figure. And, of course, had 7 heads and 10 horns. There's our 2 perfect numbers again. Not literal 7 heads. The 7 heads being representative of kingship. 7 horns of power. Had complete headship and power. And when you take a look at how she's dressed, how would you describe her dress? What type of... we've discussed what she literally looks like. Who would dress like this? Royalty would dress like this. And so this is really talking about someone who is magnificent to look at. A royal figure. Gold and precious stones. This is someone that people would recognize and people would turn to. This is not some hermit living off in the corner by him or herself. This is a person that people will know. And this is a very regal person, a very important person that we have here. And so question 3, when I get over here, is what was in the cup the woman held in her hand?
Pretty much opposite of what she looked like.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Hadn't put it together that way, but yeah, that's absolutely true. Full of abominations and purity of her sexual morality. So you think of a regal person, an important person. Usually when we think of royalty today, we think of proper people, respectable people. We don't often think, even though they do participate in this, we don't often think of the sin that they might get themselves into. And it's really, my dad always says, rich people don't commit poor people's sins. They have more money. They have a little bit more temptation. It doesn't make the poor people any better than the rich people. That's not what I'm saying. But there are different types of temptations and different types of sins that rich people can afford to get themselves into that poor people can't. Poor people have just different types of sins. And this woman here is full of all abominations. When we read of in Scriptures, there's abominations. All sin in one sense is an abomination, but we do read of certain sins that are especially grievous to God. Whether it's lying, or whether it's killing the innocent, whether it's homosexuality, fornication. There are certain sins that have different consequences, and more severe consequences in an earthly sense than others do. Lies can bring people away from the truth. homosexuality and fornication can abuse and harm our body. And so this is the woman here. Exact opposite of the way she was dressed. You would think that this was a filthy woman, and she is. But she is covering up her filthiness with this royal attire here. And so, what was on her forehead written? Oh, I guess that's question 4. What was written on the harlot's forehead? That's verse 5.
Names that identify her.
And what would those names be?
Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of abominations of the earth.
Sure. So, on her forehead was her identification. Again, as I said, people aren't going to wonder, who is this person? Remember, at this time, when the 7 churches of Revelation would understand who this is. Today, we might not understand as well. There are a couple of interpretations as to who Babylon is. It depends when you believe the book was written. There are some who believe Babylon will be Jerusalem. That is not the interpretation I take, because, not only just because I believe this book was written later, but because of the description of who this woman was and what she represented. I really do believe this was the Roman Empire. And we'll get to that in a minute. But it is Babylon the Great. She is the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. She represents all of that. And when you think of Roman society at that time, that's really what people did. Idolatry leads to fornication and abominations. We don't often think of that because we don't see idolatry in the West like we would if we lived in, say, India or China or Japan or some of those Eastern countries where idolatry is much more alive today in its temple worship. But you wonder why in the book of Corinthians, in chapter 8 and 10 especially, Paul is comparing idolatry with fornication a lot. And he has to deal with fornication a lot. Or in Acts chapter 15, when the letter that was sent to those Gentile churches told them to keep away from fornication. And we might think, why would they have to be told against that? Because that goes hand in hand with idolatry. The prostitutes lived almost at the temple of the idol temples, and that they go hand in hand. Sin goes hand in hand, and so Rome at that time, because of its idolatry, was just full of abominations and fornication. And so that is what her name is. It's written on her forehead. Again, we see this written on the forehead, the sign of the beast, the mark of the Spirit, as far as the mark of God, all written as identification, and people are going to know who is who. And so that gets us to question 5, is upon what was the woman drunk?
Blood of saints.
Blood of the saints?
And blood of the martyrs of Jesus.
And the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Are those two different people? No. It's not two different people. Two different people. The blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus are who?
Christians.
Christians. And so let's get Colossians chapter 1 verse 2, and that'll be 10. 10. Colossians chapter 1 verse 2.
To the saints, faithful brothers in Christ, at Colossae, grace to you and peace from God our Father.
Alright, so we have to the saints, to Christians. That's the introduction to the book of Colossians. And so Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ, was writing to the saints and faithful brothers. Again, people think, who's he talking to? Is he talking to two different people? It's sort of the same thing. It's sort of the same thing we see in Revelation. The saints and faithful brothers. You could not be a saint and not be a faithful brother, and you could not be a faithful brother and not be a saint. We do this all the time. We pair things. We're repetitious in one thing, and it sort of sounds better when we do that. But we have the saints and faithful brethren. And so when we have the woman was drunk on the blood of the saints, what is that saying?
A lot of them died.
A lot of them died at the hands of this woman. So if we get, what happens when people drink a lot of wine? Get drunk. And they get intoxicated. And the only way to get intoxicated on wine or alcohol is to drink a lot of it. A little bit of it, you get a little bit intoxicated. This woman was out and outright drunk. And so, as Bill said, a lot of Christians died. And a lot of Christians were martyred. And the woman got drunk on their blood. In other words, the woman here killed a lot of the saints and martyrs for Jesus. Bill?
It kind of increased their lust for killing Christians. And that's kind of what the scene you get.
Yeah.
Just ruthless. Like, it's hard for us to imagine that.
Yeah. Well, you think about it, you get drunk. People, why I've never understood this because I've never done this, but when people get drunk once, what do many people do? They get drunk again. And then they get sober and they get drunk again. They forget all the side effects. People get drunk and then they have a hangover and they hate the hangover, but then they go ahead and do it again. And they do it again and they do it again. It becomes a habit. And well, as Bill was saying, this woman got drunk on the blood of the saints, and so she continued doing it. Continued to do it, and they got bloodthirsty. They liked doing it. It was, when Nero burned down Rome, he blamed the Christians, and he went and killed Vespasian and Domitian, who were ruthless tyrants. They went and killed Christians. They burned them at the stake. They fed them to the lions. They crucified them. And they got drunk. In other words, the woman got drunk. She enjoyed doing this. And so that's the picture that we get here. And so when we have John looking at this, what was his reaction in verse 6?
It says, marveled with great amazement.
He marveled with great amazement. He was shocked. And he didn't quite understand maybe this judgment. In other words, he had seen all these great visions, but even then, after seeing this one, he was still shocked. In other words, he didn't quite understand. And so that will bring us to 7 to 18. We're not going to finish the chapter. Don't worry, I didn't give you the next chapter's questions. There's a lot to talk about in this section. And so, we won't get to all of it today. But we'll read 7 to 18. We'll start with Jeff. We'll read one slide each. Jeff, Gloria, and then across to Gord and around.
But the angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come.
This calls for a mind with wisdom. 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, another has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while.
As for the beast, that was and is not, it is an eighth, but it belongs to the seven, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast.
Bill.
These are one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are called chosen and faithful.
And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they are the beast. They and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire.
For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal powers to the beast, until the word of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw in the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth.
All right, so the angel come here, John marveled. John marveled at these things. And the angel said, why do you marvel? In other words, we're coming to the end of this book. He has seen now 3 successive visions and the interlude visions in between. And he has seen the great persecution, he has seen the warnings of judgment, and he has seen the judgment. And now we're coming to the final judgment of Rome. Because remember, at the end of the 7 vials, people didn't repent, even at that judgment. And so now we're coming to the final judgment, and John stands there amazed at how bad it is. And he's, why do you marvel? Why don't you understand? And this is one of those times where we get a clearer picture. It's not an absolute clear picture to us, but it would be to them. A clearer picture as to what these symbols represent. And so in there, we read it, and so I want to make sure that I go back to it so that I don't have to next week. The many waters, when we talked about many peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues, the reason why it's represented many waters is because this passage said it did. And so when it comes and says over here that the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. And so we know that that's what the many waters in verse 2 represented. And so the angel tells the mystery of the beast. The beast that John saw in verse 8. Let's go back to verse 8. The beast that John saw in verse 8. The one with the 7 heads and the 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw that was and is not and is about to rise from the bottomless pit. It's the emperor and symbolized the empire. There were emperors who had come. There are emperors who are, and then there are still those that are about to rise. In other words, Rome is going to continue for a while, but Rome is going to be judged. The emperor is going to be judged. He was and is not. But then he will ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. He will go to destruction. We're going to find the bottomless pit later on in this, later on in the upcoming chapters. The wicked of the earth, those who are not in the Lamb's book of life, are going to be amazed at this beast. The dwellers in the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life, will marvel to see the beast. They're going to be amazed because it was and is not and is to come. They're going to take a look at the events here, and they're going to not understand. They're just going to marvel at it. You would think the Roman Empire had fallen, but it just keeps rising up. It's like a weed you can't get rid of. One king falls and another one rises up. He falls, another one rises up. This is persistence here. And the people who are not righteous will marvel at that. in history, you have Nero dying, and later Domitian comes. And Domitian and Vespasian, and they are persecuting the church. And so, I know we're a little early, but that's as far as I really want to get this morning. Are there any comments for the next couple minutes that maybe we have, or questions from this passage? Jeff?
We talk about those things, like the Roman emperors, Nero, Domitian,
Vespasian.
These we know simply because of history books.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when we read the book of Revelation, we expect these things do refer to Rome simply because of what we know from history books. However, what we do know for sure is the people living at that time who are living through this. This is their current events. This is not their history. Whether they will know who is the power that sits over many waters. So they know. And so to them, assuming all things correct and history books correct, we are correct in our understanding that this should be Rome. And they will definitely know.
Yeah, well, that's the point I'm going to make, especially next week, when we talk about these 7 kings. Because when we take a look at 7 kings, people are going to want to say, okay, which ones? Rome had many emperors, and people will take a look at 7 kings and try to make them 7 literal kings, and they run into problems because there were a few Caesars who governed for a couple months, and so you say, well, do we count those? Well, no, we don't count those. But then you run into problems, and I think a couple people I've read, they don't want to count the first one because he really wasn't an emperor. And then you get 7 kings, and they magically get to I think it's Vespasian or Domitian, whichever one was the last one. At least at the one at John's time, if we put it at 94 to 96. And you get 7 kings, and they say, see here, 7 kings, forgetting that this is symbolic. When we come and try to make these the number 7, we've come along the entire book. We've been so disciplined. The number 7 represents completeness. And then we get to Revelation 17. We go looking for 7 kings. Why do we do that? These numbers are representative. These are symbolic. And as Jeff was saying, the people at this time, they know who this represents. They don't have a wonder. But the people who were not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, they didn't understand. This book says so. They marveled at all of this, but the Christians weren't marveling at this. They knew exactly what was going on. And so John here is using allusions to the Old Testament to point the Christians to what these visions represent. Babylon was the great world power in the Old Testament. So it is only natural to take the physical Babylon and make that symbolic of the current world power, which of course at that time was Rome. Whenever you want to come and conclude this book was written, it was Rome. And so we need to, especially in this chapter, the next chapter, and chapter 19 and 20, we need to keep in mind that this is using symbolic imagery and symbolic language. If we forget that, this is where we get into trouble. This is where we start speculating on events, and we start trying to go to history and say, what events represented all of these things? Forgetting that we're talking about an overall arching judgment. Was Rome judged? Yes, it was. Were these visions representative of God's judgment? Yes, they were. But were the visions literally what was going to happen to Rome? Well, the stars come crashing down to the earth. The sun is darkened. No, that's not what happened, but it's symbolic of the judgment that would. God's judgment was complete. God's judgment was just, and it came when He said it would.
I'm not